Hey, what's up YouTube? I recently participated in my first ever game jam, the 2025 Epic Mega Jam. It was an amazing learning experience and I highly encourage anyone to take part in a game jam. It teaches you how to, well, how should I put it? Get shit done. Yeah, that's it. Now, my game is pretty minimalist, focusing mostly on movement. And in this video, I want to walk you through my method for working with the character movement component and how I augmented it to create custom movement modes. There are tons of tutorials out there showing how to implement various movement modes. Zelda-like climbing, wall running, you name it. And they are all great. But when people try to add multiple movement modes, like a Zelda-style climb and a wall run ability, they often run into issues. The reason is that most tutorials don't explain how to build a flexible framework that easily lets you mix and match these modes. And that's exactly what I want to help with. That said, I expect this will gradually change as people start migrating to Mover 2.0, which is designed to be much more flexible and extendable than the somewhat rigid character movement component, which I refer to as the CMC. The CMC is still great and definitely still has a long life ahead of it. Now, it does provide a framework for implementing custom movement modes, but there's not much you can do with it in blueprints. Sure, you can switch the movement component to a custom mode in Blueprint, but beyond that, things get pretty limited. You're really meant to dive into C++ if you want to extend the character movement component. Personally, I've always liked the CMC, but I've never been a huge fan of it as a framework, so I've always used a hybrid approach. It's nothing revolutionary, just a simple solution, but despite its simplicity, I've used this technique here and there and it has worked really well for me. And one great thing about this setup is that it lets you get an animation state machine working with minimal effort. Now, don't expect too much from this video. This is all in all a very simple solution that can be implemented in a couple of days at most. As such, it's probably best suited for simple single-player games. I won't be covering replication here. And since locomotion and movement are usually critical gameplay elements, I consider any blueprint solution a bit of a hack. But that doesn't mean it can't get the job done, right? Not everyone is building the next AAA game, and not everyone needs the most foolproof solution, especially for a game jam. So in this video, I'll walk you through my setup. I'll start by explaining the core idea, dive into the blueprint to cover the basics, and then move on to more concrete examples, like how I implemented wall running, swimming, ledge grabs, and all that good stuff. Now again, I'm not claiming this is anything groundbreaking. It's basic, but in a good way. Most projects don't require a complex C++ solution or a full gameplay ability system. Sometimes all it takes is adding a simple blueprint layer to get things done. So let's dive in. Here's my thought process. The CMC comes with some really cool and complex features. For example, substepping. The character can be airborne in its falling mode, land on a surface, switch to walking mode, and then continue its remaining movement on the ground, applying surface friction and everything else, all in a single frame. This gives the movement a buttery smooth feel. That's great. Another feature is a proper apex subdivision, which ensures the apex event always triggers at the peak of the character's jump. Now, let's say I want to create a custom movement mode that includes some kind of airborne physics. The last thing I want to do is re-implement all that stuff, right? I'd rather use the falling state as a base and just add a layer on top of it. And that's pretty much the core of my thinking when working with the CMC. The 4 CMC modes I'm going to use are walking, falling, flying, which I'll use only in rare occasions for very specific use cases, because this mode lets you stand still in the air while applying root motion, so that can be handy. and finally none. And I'll approach it with that understanding, meaning I'm aware that launching the character or calling the jump function will automatically switch it to falling mode, and landing on a surface will switch it back to walking, and so on. So I'll let the CMC handle all of that, and I'll just add my own custom layer on top of it by listening to the large amount of events the CMC triggers, like on jump, on landed, on walking off ledge, and so forth. My approach is honestly very simple, and the key to it is enums. Enums, enums, enums. I've tried other methods, but I always come back to the simple solution. Sometimes the simplest things just work best. Here I have an enum to define the different modes my character can be in. For each mode, I also have a corresponding enum to define its sub-modes. For example, the locomotion mode can be further broken down into sub-modes like idle, walk, run, and so on. For each mode and sub-mode, I implement a start function, an end function, and a tick function. These are usually pretty minimal and straightforward. When a start function, such as say start air, is called, it triggers the end function for the current movement mode, for example, locomotion. Then the end function for the locomotion sub-mode, like idle, is called, and the sub-mode is set to none. This ensures that any changes made to the character movement component when entering either the locomotion mode or its idle sub-mode are undone. The mode is then updated and the sub-mode start function is called. As a result, subsequent events, like the tick event or user inputs, will depend on the current mode and sub-mode. In essence, this framework acts as a very simple two-level state machine, adding an extra layer on top of the character movement component, which continues to function independently in the background. So I'll first showcase a simplified example using template functions and a basic enum describing two modes, A and B, each with two sub-modes. Note that each mode and sub-mode must have a none option as well. The first step is to create a start, tick, and end function for each mode, A and B, and each of their sub-modes. The second step is to create a function to tick the mode and forward the delta time from the tick event. This function can then control the tick flow using the mode enum, calling the necessary tick function, which, based on the sub-mode, will tick the correct sub-mode. And in there, you can do whatever you want. The same principle applies to inputs. You can direct the flow of inputs using these enums, right? Next, we need a function to update the mode, and a function to update the sub-mode of each mode, A and B. They all share a similar principle. First, we check if the mode to set isn't already the current one. You could add a boolean option to force the update even if it's true or something like that. Next, catch the current mode in the previous enum and perform a switch to exit the previous mode. Then set the new mode. Now, exiting a mode involves calling the correct end sub-mode function, caching the current sub-mode in the previous enum and setting the sub-mode to none. That's it. The only difference between the update mode and update sub-mode functions is that the update mode function does not call the mode start function because the mode start function is actually what's going to be called by the user, triggering this update. The sub-mode, however, needs to be started once updated. And so all that's left to do is set up each start mode function. Start A will update the mode to A and update the sub-mode to whatever is specified here. And same thing for start B. Voila, that's our basic state machine. And it's important to understand the flow of events because I'll mention it several times in the rest of the video. So from a user's perspective, all you need to do is call the start function of a mode and specify the sub-mode to start in. Let's pretend we are in mode B and we call the start A function. This function is called, and in turn it calls the end B function. Whatever sub-mode we're currently in is ended, which could mean a number of things, right? The sub-mode is set to none, and then the mode is set to A. And that's it for this function. Next, this function is called, so if we happen to be in any mode, which we theoretically shouldn't be since exiting a mode means setting that mode's sub-mode to none. But still, if we are in a sub-mode, we call the necessary end function, set the sub-mode, and then call the necessary start function. Essentially, what you're left with is a simple framework that lets you tweak the character movement component or any variable using an event-driven system. Say I'm entering this mode and then this sub-mode, which means I could run faster or something, and so I tweak this variable. That means when I exit this sub-mode, I simply need to undo the change to that variable so it's back to the default and so on. The flow of events, like tick and inputs, can then be easily controlled using enums. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's dive deeper into the character blueprint, and I'll walk you through everything in more detail as we go. Here's the full graph. It's pretty clean, as you can see, because everything is contained within functions. Here are the begin play, end play, and tick events. These are my input events. Most inputs call a begin and end function. The end functions don't do anything for now, but they are there to maintain a consistent framework. Having a begin function called for an end function to exist, and if needed, they are ready to be used. Some inputs, like the move input, fire continuously, so I forward the input to the appropriate function based on the current movement mode. Again, just to clarify, this movement mode has nothing to do with the CMC's actual movement mode, right? It's an additional custom layer I've added on top. Anyway, for example, in the locomotion mode, I simply forward the movement axis to apply a movement input in world space. Finally, the abort input is filtered based on the current movement mode and sub-mode. For example, if I want to abort a WallRun, I simply call this start base movement function, which will either start the locomotion or air mode, depending on whether the character movement component is actually falling or walking. So it's really just a matter of calling a start function for a specific mode. Anyway, finally, here are all the CMC events I listened to: on walking off ledge, on launched, on jumped, on hit, on landed. Most of these functions are very simple. On walking off ledge stores a timestamp for that event, which allows me to perform a coyote jump. This event is treated as a fake jump and calls the start air function with the fall sub-mode. On launched simply stores a timestamp, which could be useful later to prevent spamming further jumps, etc. On jumped doesn't do anything, because I don't rely on the CMC's jump and stop jumping nodes. I prefer to just launch the character myself and handle all the extra jump features, like say double jumps, coyote jump, and longer jumps if the spacebar is held down. The on hit event is a little more complex. It branches based on the current mode. For example, if we're in wall mode and hit something, we likely need to update the WallRun to continue it or abort it depending on the hit result. Finally, the on-landed event simply calls the start locomotion function. So the entire graph is really simple thanks to handling modes and sub-modes and just calling the necessary start functions. Say I'm on the ground in the locomotion mode and idle sub-mode and I want to jump. Let's look at the jump begin input function. First, I have a macro to check whether the character is able to perform this ability. This is done using a simple gameplay tag container stored on the character. That way you can easily add tags when the character gains an ability or something similar. All you need to do is create gameplay tags in the project settings, and that's it. So if the character is able to jump, I do a little check to prevent spamming jumps, and then branch based on the current movement mode, such as locomotion. Next, depending on the locomotion sub-mode, I can further filter the jump input, like preventing jumps when the character is dashing. For the other states, since a jump can trigger many different things, I perform a few checks, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's assume all the checks fail and I proceed with a simple jump. In that case, I launch the character, which triggers a change in the CMC's movement mode to falling. Again, this state machine setup makes it easy to create custom behaviors. For example, if I'm sprinting, I can make the jump more powerful or add some other custom logic. Next, I track the jump count, play the jump or double jump animation, and trigger some VFX. Then I call the start air function and ask for the jump sub-mode. This updates the mode by first calling the end function for locomotion, which in turn calls the end function for the locomotion idle sub-mode. The locomotion sub-mode is then set to none, the mode is changed to air, and finally the air sub-mode is set, triggering the sub-mode start function. Now, after launching the character, the next event that will likely trigger is onLanded, which will call another start function and the process repeats. This would start the locomotion mode, call the end air function, and with it the end air jump function, set the air sub-mode to none, set the mode back to locomotion, call the start locomotion idle function, and set the locomotion sub-mode. Another example, if the character walks off a ledge, it would call the start air function with the fall sub-mode and so on. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's very easy to implement, minimalist, and provides a lot of flexibility. Here's the result in-game with debug information shown in the top left corner. You can see the current and previous modes, as well as the current and previous sub-modes of the current mode. You can see that the locomotion sub-mode keeps updating. This happens in the tick event, tick locomotion common, which contains the logic shared by all locomotion sub-modes. And basically, based on factors like planar speed, inputs, and abilities, I update the locomotion sub-mode to either idle, walk, run, sprint. You get the idea. Nothing too impressive so far, right? Hopefully you're not bored yet. I'd understand if you were, because this isn't augmenting the character movement component in any way, at least not yet. Again, the goal here is to create a simple framework that makes it easy to add new movement modes. So let's take a look at one, WallRun. In my game, a WallRun can be either vertical or horizontal, left or right. This is handled using the wall sub-mode. Now this is where my approach with the CMC may start to make sense. A WallRun is essentially just a jump with the gravity scale adjusted. That's it. So during a WallRun, the CMC is in its falling mode. So you can start a WallRun by pressing the jump input while in locomotion mode, or by hitting a wall while in air mode. Both actions call the same two methods to check if a vertical or horizontal WallRun can begin. Upon jumping here, and when hitting an obstacle here. and they essentially do the same thing, so I'll just focus on that one. If not already in wall mode, and if a WallRun is possible, I get the movement direction. This means getting the movement input in world space, or if it's 0, get the normalized 2D velocity, or if that's also 0, get the actor's forward vector. Next, check if the vertical velocity isn't at a limit. Only then do I perform line traces to find a wall. Here's how it works. One trace is done at shoulder height, and another near the fleet. It's essentially a line trace for objects, and I've created a special object channel to describe movement volumes. This allows for precise control over which surfaces are wall-runnable. For example, that cube is contained within a volume, and that box volume has an object type of movement configured to overlap objects of type pawn. This volume movement blueprint also has a tag container to specify the kind of movement it describes. And obviously the characters capsule is also configured to overlap objects of type movement. So during a wall run, I only want to check for wall run volumes. So I use a simple function to gather actors to exclude from the line traces. This array contains all overlapping movement volumes, and is managed via an interface when the character begins or ends an overlap with a movement volume. See, the movement volume base class contains minimal logic. That's this actor I just highlighted, right? It simply sends itself to whatever overlaps it, the character. And so the character keeps track of all volumes. I really like this approach because it allows me to iterate through the array and filter volumes based on context, priority, and various parameters to determine the best course of action when movement volumes are relevant, such as during a jump or similar events. The overlap event itself doesn't do anything crucial, it simply manages the array. And this is also how I trigger other movement modes. When the player stands in a movement volume and presses jump, I simply loop through all the volumes to see which movement can be started. If no movement mode can be started, I proceed with the wall run checks, and if those fail, I eventually fall back to a simple jump. This is an example of the mode I called IV Climb. A volume describes IV movement, so this volume is part of the array and gets iterated when I press jump, allowing me to potentially enter IV mode. But I digress, back to wall mode. So here I loop through all volumes and create a list of those not describing a wall run for the line trace. Next, if both traces hit, I cache the hit normal, actor, and primitive. Next, I perform a few arbitrary checks to determine if the conditions are right to start a horizontal wall run. Do we have at least some planar velocity? Does the input direction align with the wall normal at a reasonable angle? And is the character's velocity in the direction of the wall? Then I project the input direction onto the wall, normalize it, and use it to define the direction of the wall run. This lets me determine whether the horizontal wall run will be to the left or to the right of the character. And this, in turn, allows me to call the start wall function, which does the same thing as the start air or start locomotion functions. I update the movement mode, exit the current movement mode, and set the new one, blah blah blah. You get the idea. Oh, and I forgot to mention that bit. I also update the CMC's orient to movement variable based on the mode. Some may prevent the character to orient itself to face the movement direction. Anyway, next I cache the velocity when entering a new mode, which will become relevant for the swim mode. Also, if necessary, I stop movement upon entering certain modes. I set the movement mode on the character movement component this time, though note that this might be redundant for certain modes. For example, performing a basic jump initially launches the character, which causes the CMC to immediately switch to the falling mode. The air mode is then started, which sets the CMC mode to falling again. It's not a big deal. Anyway, the CMC gravity scale and air control variables are also tweaked per mode. Notice the lowered gravity for the wall mode. Once the mode is updated, I set some WallRun related variables that were computed in the check-wall function earlier. A VFX is spawned and I call the WallRun Sub-Mode start function. This in turn launches the character to physically start the WallRun, and that's it. At this point, the character is in wall mode on the left or right sub-mode, and it has started its ballistic trajectory to mimic a wall run. Let's now look at what happens during the next frame, during the tick event. The tick-wall command function does nothing except print debug info. The tick-wall sideways function, however, performs a few tasks. Most importantly, I perform the same 2 line traces as during the initial wall run check to ensure the wall is still there. Now, if the checks are inconsistent, you could encounter glitches or unexpected behaviors, such as starting a wall run that may only last for a single frame because immediately cancelled the next frame. That's why it's crucial to use the same checks when determining if a wall run can be started, whether triggered by input or a hit, or continued during the tick event. Ideally, you'd use a function and not copy-paste nodes around, but that's another topic. If for any reason the wall run fails, like if the character reaches the end of the wall run ends by calling the base movement start function, which transitions to either the start air or start locomotion function. This in turn causes the state machine to call the relevant end functions for the wall mode and its sub-modes, blah 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 blah. You get the idea. Now, if the wall run can continue this tick, I update the wall normal and wall direction from the traces. Here I've simply averaged the 2 hit normals, which should be identical anyway. The details aren't too important and are up to your preferences anyway. My goal here is to share the overall workflow. Anyway, the current wall direction is reprojected against the new wall normal and normalized. Now, keep in mind that the character movement component is still falling at this point, so it's updating the capsule's vertical location with gravity and doing its own thing. So I can use the capsule's location, or actor's location, same thing really for the character class, as the base location for the traces. And since both traces are equally offset upward and downward, the average of the 2 hit locations gives me the same Z component as the character Z component updated by the CMC. In other words, using this vector's Z component won't affect the vertical component of the ballistic trajectory. Now for the X and Y components, since I'm using line traces, the hit locations represent actual points on the wall, so that won't do for updating the character's X and Y location. That's why I offset the averaged hit location using the wall normal and the character's capsule radius, plus a safety offset. Then I lerp that new location over time using delta time to smoothly bring the character flush against the wall. This is especially important when the character starts a wall run from a distance away from the wall, like when pressing jump near a wall but not completely against it yet. The same principle applies to the character's rotation, which is smoothly updated to face the wall direction. And you can see this in action by pushing the system to unreasonable extremes. Let's reduce the lerp speed and increase the distance at which a wall run can be started and maintained. As you can see, the character's location is smoothly updated to be flush against the wall while inheriting the Z component from the CMC in fall mode, as it updates the capsule's vertical location on its own. Also, the wall run is immediately terminated upon hitting the ground. And this kinda magically happens because the start locomotion function is called when the CMC broadcasts its on-landed event. And that in turn updates the movement mode, calls the end wall function, resets the gravity scale to 1.0 and so on. You get the idea by now. It undoes anything that was done when entering the wall mode. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit tricky to cover everything, but I'm doing my best. Now, two things could happen during a wall run. An input might be pressed, or an obstacle might be hit. First, inputs. Thanks to the state machine, controlling input flow is very easy. In my case, I don't want the move input to affect the wall run, so it simply does nothing while in wall mode. The dash input behaves the same way, it does nothing in wall mode. A jump, however, is allowed. I simply launch the character, increment the jump count, start a rotation interpolation so the character faces the jump direction, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and call the start air method. The difference between jumping off a vertical and horizontal wall run is easily controlled by the sub-mode. The launch direction and speed can be adjusted, as well as the direction the character faces during the jump. Easy peasy. Finally, the player can also abort a wall run. And once again, thanks to this framework, it's simply a matter of calling the start air or start locomotion methods. Simple as that. Now, what about hitting obstacles? Since the character movement component is in its falling mode during a wall run, hitting an obstacle triggers a hit event. When that happens, I simply line trace for movement volumes along the hit normal, just like during tick. Then I compare the newly hit wall normal with the current one to see if the angle allows the wall run to continue. If it does, I update the wall normal and reproject the wall direction. Finally, I reset the character's planar velocity as the hit event likely caused a loss of momentum, and I want to prevent that. And that's basically it. Again, it's all smoke and mirrors. Just a bunch of launches with gravity modified. But yeah, it works. Wall runs can continue if the angle between the walls is less than 45 degrees. However, you can also jump from a wall run, and since it launches you at a 45-degree angle, this allows you to link wall runs on perpendicular walls. Pretty cool. I'll keep it brief since it shares many similarities with the wall mode, thanks again to sticking to a consistent framework. So just like for wall runs, I have a movement volume blueprint that defines a water volume. Upon overlapping with it, the water volume is added to this list. Then during either the air or locomotion mode, every tick I check if the character overlaps with any water volume, and if the character is submerged enough to start the swim mode. The start swim function caches the water volume as well as the initial swim velocity. This velocity is stored in a variable when the mode changes, because some modes, like swim, may immediately stop any movement since I'll apply my own, which causes the actor's velocity to read as 0 from that point onward. Next, the start swim function checks if we're already over the max swim speed. Buoyancy is simulated using a float spring to drive the actor's z location, and its initial velocity is simply the character's z velocity upon entering the swim mode. I then spawn the swim splashes VFX on the water surface. Next, movement input. I first check if the movement input in world space isn't 0, and if we are not currently exceeding the maximum swim speed. If both conditions are met, I apply acceleration, so acceleration times delta time added to the current velocity. I then clamp the velocity if it exceeds the max swim speed. If we were over the max swim speed when entering the water volume, I skip this step and re-evaluate that statement. Next, tick. So tick movements, tick swim common. If there's no input, so no acceleration, I need to decelerate the character if the velocity isn't already 0. So I simply subtract the deceleration amount times delta time from the current velocity and check if that causes the character to reverse direction. If so, I stop the character. Next, based on the final swim velocity, I try to apply the movement. So first I compute the movement to apply, and with it I try to offset the actor. If there's no collision, great, we're done. If not, I want to try again. We're already gone as far as possible, so I calculate the remaining movement based on the hit time. For example, a hit time of 0.99 means there's just 0.01% of movement left. So I compute that and project the remaining movement against the hit normal, while also projecting the swim velocity. This process repeats until there's no movement left to apply, or we hit the max iteration count. And this essentially lets us slide against walls and other obstacles. Now, a couple of images might help clarify what's going on. Here's our capsule and a wall, and here's the amount of movement we expect to apply this frame. In the first iteration, there's a hit, so we move as far as we can. In the second iteration, we project the remaining movement along the hit normal and try to move in that direction. In this case, there are no more obstacles, so we indeed applied the entirety of the movement that frame. That's it. Next, I do the fake buoyancy. I use the character Z location as the current value and the water surface Z location as the target value. And that gives me the new Z value to apply. Finally, I smoothly orient the character towards the movement direction. I also update the swim sub-mode based on the planar velocity, idle or move. Next, I check if the character is on ground in shallow water with a foothold on walkable ground. If so, I start the locomotion mode. Finally, when jumping, I simply check for ledges using the recovery mode, which I'll explain next. And voila! For the IV mode, it's as simple as it gets. When jumping in locomotion mode, I check for any overlapping movement volumes. If one of them is designated for IV movement, IV mode can be started. This caches the IV actor, resets the velocity, and updates both the movement mode and sub-mode. Next, when input is detected and the player moves up or down, I adjust the velocity to accelerate accordingly. On tick, that velocity is thus applied. But first, if there's no input, we may probably need to decelerate, so do that. The velocity is then applied as vertical movement, and I sweep along the actor's offset to check for collisions. If a collision occurs, we might be on the ground, so we switch to locomotion mode if valid ground is detected, otherwise we go to air mode. If no collisions occur while applying the movement, I check the character Z position relative to the IV in a range from 0 to 1, 0 at the bottom, 1 at the top. If the position exceeds 1, the top is reached. In that case, I launch the character slightly upward and forward to land on the platform, transitioning to air mode. Afterward, I smoothly update the character's X and Y position and orientation. The sub-mode is then updated, which doesn't affect gameplay directly, but drives the simplest animation graph. And that's it. I press jump, IV mode starts, I press up and I move up. When I reach the top, it transitions to air mode. I may then press jump again and press down to move down until I hit the ground and it transitions back to locomotion mode. Sweet. Another feature I was able to easily implement using this framework is the ledge grab, which I call the recovery mode. What I implemented for the game jam is quite minimalist, but it can be expanded to support more complex recovery sub-modes based on factors like height, impact velocity and more. The good thing about my approach is that it supports movable platforms, something that some AAA games don't even handle properly, and that always frustrates me. It works on the same principles that the CMC uses to keep the character grounded on movable platforms. So I have a function called check start recovery that gets called when a hit is registered while in air or locomotion mode, or manually when ending a vertical wall run. In this function, I first check if the character is able to perform the recovery movement. Then, to prevent repeated checks due to multiple collisions, I use a simple timer to limit when this function can be called. Next, if no direction is suggested, I get the movement input direction. Again, this could be the input direction itself, the velocity direction, or simply the direction the character is facing. Next, I perform a couple of capsule traces. This essentially replicates what the character movement component does when it encounters a step. I trace upward, then forward, and then downward. And that capsule trace macro is exactly what it sounds like, a capsule trace. I also may check the hit actor for specific tags to identify actors or surfaces that are eligible for recovery, but feel free to come up with your own system. If I hit anything, I check if that surface is walkable using the character movement component's find floor function. After that, I check the difference in height between the character's Z position and the surface Z position. And I also ensure that the character is facing that surface at an appropriate angle. If all of that checks out, I may call the start recovery function, which, like the other start functions, does the following. It updates the movement mode, exiting whatever mode we were previously in, blah 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 blah. It also caches the capsule's current location and rotation, and the target location and rotation. Now, here's where the magic happens. If the primitive hit during the find floor function is movable, I store the start and target locations and rotations relative to that primitive. This essentially allows the recovery mode to work with movable platforms. During the tick event, the tick recovery function transforms the start and target location and rotation back to world space, essentially applying any movement of the primitive. You can also decide whether to prevent roll and pitch depending on your needs. All that's left to do is lerp the character's location and rotation from the start to the target values. So upon starting the recovery mode, I reset the interpolation progress value to 0. Then I increment it in the tick function to drive the two lerps. If it equals or exceeds 1, we're done with the recovery, and we can start locomotion mode if the character finds a walkable surface at the recovered location. If not, we switch to air mode. And again, an image might clarify things a bit. Here's the character's capsule and here's a ledge. The check function gets the recovery target location in world space. And so if it remained in world space during the tick function, it wouldn't follow the ledge if it were to move, right? So the start and target locations are made relative to the primitive. It's like the primitive is the new world origin untransformed. Thus, it can then be easily converted back to world space using the primitive's world transform, which essentially makes the start and target locations stick to the primitive. Now, the main caveat is that this simple lerp might cause the capsule to go through the primitive. This could upset Unreal Engine, so I tend to disable the capsule's collision while in recovery mode. However, that has a side effect. The downward force from gravity won't be applied to physics-driven platforms while the capsule collision is disabled. One simple workaround for this is to manually apply the same force that the character would normally have. Note that disabling the capsule's collision might also affect hit events, and that can be an issue if you rely on the capsule to receive damage or other interactions. Now, that still causes the character to visually clip through the primitive. So back in the day, what I ended up doing was record that interpolation trajectory. It was always the same since the traces were hard-coded, right? This allowed me to animate the recovery movements for the character in place and account for the capsule's trajectory, kinda like a reverse root motion, if that makes sense. And voila, this system is simple but effective. A recovery can be easily triggered from any mode, such as from a vertical wall run. The best part is that it works with both movable platforms and physics-driven platforms. Cool, right? When it comes to movement that transitions to air upon jumping, I often want to smoothly orient the character towards the jump direction. This is done easily with a minimalist method. In air mode, the character is prevented from orienting towards the movement direction. This means I can safely modify the actor's rotation without any external systems interfering with it. So I have this begin air rotation interp function, which gets called when jumping off a vertical or horizontal wall run. Again, this system is very minimalist, so there's not much to it. It caches the desired interpolation speed, resets the interpolation progress, caches the current actor rotation and the target rotation, and sets a boolean flag to true, triggering the tick function when the air mode is active. Tick, tick air, come on, there. And in that tick function, I simply increment the progress value to interpolate between the start and target rotations. When the progress reaches or exceeds 1, I stop the interpolation by setting the boolean flag back to false. I also clear the cached values to ensure things are cleaned up properly. And that's pretty much it. When I jump away from walls, I can smoothly orient the character towards the jump direction, but only while in air mode. If the character lands while this interpolation is happening, I don't even worry about it. The transition to locomotion mode will stop the air mode, and in the process, I ensure that any ongoing interpolation is cancelled. Last thing I want to go over is the animation blueprint. It's going to be brief because, as you'll see, it's pretty self-explanatory. In the animation blueprint, I simply copy the active mode and sub-modes from the character blueprint. This lets me build a super simple anim graph using blends based on enums. Now, this is far from perfect, and you tend to lose control over how to transition from one pose to another since you only have a blend speed to work with. But still, you can build decent animations with this setup. See, this is my entire animation graph. There's not even an animation state machine per se. There's the locomotion mode playing looping animations for each sub-mode. The sprint animation, for instance, is just the run animation, but with extra tilt forward. Slots can then be used to control where animations montage are played, which I use a lot. Same thing basically for air, wall and other modes. You can then add a control rig to apply physics and such. And maybe add a slot to isolate the upper body so you can play additive impact landing animations on that specific slot, etc. Super simple and, let's be honest, limited, but oh well, it can get the job done. Anyway, that wraps up this video. Hopefully you found something useful in this breakdown. I know this isn't the most exciting stuff. It's pretty old school and rudimentary, especially considering how Unreal Engine has made so many advancements in animation and character logic, with features like mover, motion matching, anim chooser, and all sorts of groundbreaking tech. But still, one might get caught up in worrying about the quote-unquote right way to do things, about using the most up-to-date, technically advanced methods. And in doing so, they might risk over-engineering and never actually shipping anything. I speak from experience and I include myself in that group. The takeaway here is that honestly, when you know your game is simple and has simple needs, focus on simple solutions and ship. It ain't dumb if it works. And hacking your way around the character movement component in Blueprint, if that's what you're familiar with, using at least a minimal framework can go a long way. Thus, since movement-based games are probably my favorite genre, and because these games played a big role in my own journey of learning Unreal Engine, I wanted to at least make a video about it. So let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'd also love to hear about your own experiences building custom movement modes in Unreal Engine. Voila, the files are available as a tier 3 reward on my Patreon. Speaking of which, a big thank you to my Patreon supporters for their continued support. And just to clarify, this project, available on my Patreon, does not include the Unreal project for my epic Mega Jam entry, but rather the character movement framework discussed in this video, along with a very basic game. So let me walk you through it so I can give you a quick tutorial in case you want to try it out, and also share some important news regarding the future of this channel. So you can jump, double jump, and dash using the shift key or the right trigger. The goal is to find and collect all the pickups scattered throughout the level. These pickups also serve as a resource. You can press the R key or Y on the Xbox controller to consume one of these resources and respawn at the last safe location. This allows you to retry a failed jump or optimize your path to collect all the pickups in the shortest time possible. So you can run straight at a wall, hold the move input and press jump to start a vertical wall run. You can then press jump to jump away from the wall, and even automatically link multiple vertical wall runs by hitting another wall and maintaining the move input towards it. You can also perform horizontal wall runs on straight walls and curved walls. You can press jump at any time to jump away from a wall at a 45 degrees angle, allowing you to link perpendicular walls. Note that the wall run will continue until you reach the end of the wall, at which point you're in the air straight, enabling you to perform a double jump. Keep in mind that you can dash in the air even towards the wall to initiate a vertical or horizontal wall run. Additionally, you can press jump on certain platforms to teleport upward, nothing too fancy. Oh, and you can control the camera with the left and right arrows or the right thumbstick. That's pretty much it. Good luck collecting them all. Now, regarding the YouTube channel. As some of you may already know, I'll be stopping the YouTube channel likely in 2 or 3 months. I'll also be putting a hold on the Patreon, at least for the foreseeable future, though I do hope to upload content sporadically from time to time. No promises. I've explained the reasons in more detail on my Patreon and on my socials, but the gist of it is that I've reached a point where I want to try new things. And I'm proud to announce I'll be joining Blue 12 Studios starting in late February. I will also be taking some time off to focus on both my mental and physical health, which I really need. That said, I have a couple of videos in the works and I want to go out with a bang. So fingers crossed I can make that happen. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Bye bye!